to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I'm your host, Beth Stallwood, and I'm excited that you have chosen to listen to this podcast today. In this episode, I am joined by Helen Beedham, author of The Future of Time, How Reworking Time Can Help You Boost Productivity, Diversity and Wellbeing. Helen has had an incredible career in the world of management consultancy, in helping organisations to develop, to grow, to do their thing even better than they have done before. And she's all about creating work cultures where individuals and teams can flourish and deliver successfully. And in this conversation, we talk about Helen's career, what drives her, and also this idea around how time and the management of time isn't just an individual's responsibility, but we need to look at it from the lens of the individual, which is important, but also the organisation, the structure within which the people work, and how we can work together, have some new conversations, open up, get new boundaries in place, so many different things about what Helen calls time intelligence. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. I know I did. Well, hello and welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I'm your host, Beth Stallwood, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Helen Beedham. And I met Helen as an author we've been published by the same author, and I'm really interested in her approach to the future of time and all kinds of things from her wonderful, wonderful career. But rather than me introduce Helen, I'm going to hand over to you, Helen. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Beth, very much for having me on the show. I love listening to your podcast, so it's just fabulous to be joining you at the microphone. So a little bit about me. Well, I am kind of 25 plus years into my career, which started in the early days at Harrods, of all places. Yes, a very celeb-packed first couple of years, introduction into the world of work. Mainly there because I wanted to learn about business, and I was on the management training scheme. And took a fairly unusual path, actually, after 3 months there. Ended up working for a director on various store improvement projects and realised that I loved kind of organisation improvements more than I loved retail, working Sundays and very, very long hours over Christmas. So, and not great pay. So I moved at that point into management consulting, where I spent the larger part of my career, about 15 years, in the same organisation. Loved it, did all sorts of work developing my organisation and development, change management skills, basically helping organisations manage major changes, bring people along with them, and anything from restructurings to mergers and acquisitions, developing new mission, vision and values, changing the culture, all of that. Had great colleagues, even met my husband through that job.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, another fellow consultant, and loved it. I only left really when our daughter was born. She's now 11. After 15 years, I knew I was ready to actually at that point put parenting first for a little while she was tiny. So took 2 years out from the world of work after she was born. And then through somebody I'd met actually at a mother and toddler group, ended up helping to grow a small company, professional network called City Mothers at the time. We then rebranded to City Parents. It's now called Work Life Central. And it's a professional network / now content portal sharing advice on career, well-being, families, etc., workplace topics. So co-ran that really with my friend, the founder, for 6 years and helped grow it very successfully. Great entrepreneurial experience. And then in the summer of 2020, just as we were, getting used to the pandemic, I took the move to go freelance because I thought, hey, the world's changing. It seems a good transition point. Why not? And that's when I started my own business, Helen Beedham Consulting Limited, working as an independent organizational expert, speaker, podcaster and author, as you mentioned. Thanks for getting a quick mention of the book in there. So as you said, we share the same publisher, and I wrote my book during the first lockdown, and it published on the 1st of March last year, The Future of Time. So I'm sure we'll chat more about that. So that's really what I'm doing now, mainly. Yeah, consulting, giving talks, group and one-to-one coaching, and working with teams.
Brilliant. And it's so interesting that the Harrods kind of thing is that literally last weekend I went to Harrods for afternoon tea, which was a delayed 40th birthday present. So it's like all these things get connected. And isn't it interesting? The thing I find really interesting about that is we don't always like the whole thing of our job, but there's always something about it that we kind of feel really connected by it. So you found the bit of the job that you liked and went and did more of that and less of the thing that you didn't like about the job.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really glad I worked there and got to experience an industry for long enough to realise, as you say, which bits I really enjoyed doing, the kind of problem solving, the working with teams bit, the figuring out, okay, how can we do this better bit? And which bits of the job weren't working for me, weren't getting me excited. So I had a much better idea 2 years into my career of perhaps what would be a good next step or a good next 5 years. I was hoping. I didn't really expect to stay 15, but I just ticked a lot of boxes. Job 2. So
yeah, and it's so interesting because I think many of us in the world actually at some point did some kind of retail job, right? There's often retail customer service, that kind of role early on in our career. And I did a retail job. I worked in Clark's shoe shops as a kind of shoe fitter, assistant manager, that type of role. And the bit I liked about it was the people bit and the developing people bit and the kind of working with customers bit. And that then led me into kind of the world of customer service and delivering training and things. So it's about which bits do you really like? And I think for anyone who's listening, who's in that state of work gloom, who's thinking, I don't like my job, really search for the bits of your job you do like and then work from there about what kind of job allows you to do more of that stuff. And that often is easier to do than kind of going, I want to be this and have a job title in mind. It's like what kind of reverse engineer it from the bits that you really, really like.
Yes, that's such great advice. And I know your new book is full of fantastic advice like that. And it reminds me of something a parenting expert once told me, which is when you're talking to your child or any child, don't ask them what do you want to be when you grow up? Ask them, what do you want to do? Because it's less about hanging a label on your identity, which you might feel stuck with for a long time, and more about a mindset of trying stuff, experimenting, seeing what works, doing more, moving direction, and a constant kind of journey of enjoying and trying things, which I really love that advice.
And it's so interesting, even just as an adult sitting here listening to that advice, so often we do connect our identity with the job that we do. So it's like, hi, I'm Beth and I do this. Or people often ask that question before we ask kind of what do you do or what do you enjoy about your work? We kind of get into the what's the title stuff. I really like the idea of thinking more about what are you actually doing in your job? You know, are you working with people? Are you working on your own? Are you on a computer? Are you out there physically doing something? There's so much richer information from that kind of question than there is from the what do you want to be?
Yeah, I agree. I think if we were to ask whoever's sitting next to us at dinner that we met for the first time or something, what is it you love about what you do? You'll get such an interesting answer compared to just what is it that you do.
Yeah,
it tells us so much about them, and we'll probably have a lot more fun conversation as well.
Yeah, and that question, like, what do you love about your work? Even for the people who are in work gloom, there'll be something. They'll be able to find something, and it's a much nicer conversation if it's somebody new to talk about what is it you love about your job, because people light up and you get really animated and really engaged with the conversation. Whereas if you kind of get into that, oh, my job's really boring conversation, it's probably not quite so fun. So maybe a bit of advice from this podcast already is, if you're sat there with somebody new, ask them what they love about their job and see where the conversation leads you.
Yeah, great one.
Love it. And then the other thing I'm really interested about in your career is obviously moving into consulting seems like a really sensible move. You get to work on all the things about making stuff better. And then this thing about obviously taking some time out, which so many people do. And then you find your next job in the most unusual of places, a mother and toddler group.
Yes. I know, hadn't planned that.
Yeah, no recruitment agents, no looking on job boards, no application process. You're like, right, mother and toddler group is where I'm going to find it. Isn't it amazing where you can find a new job from?
Yes, and actually the other thing that I learnt from that was that it wasn't first up a job offer with, an employment contract and a salary. It was actually, can you just help me out, very part-time, in the early days, just on a pro bono basis, because the organization was so small and young. It was just really a small group of volunteers. And so I said, yeah, sure. For me, it seemed a low risk way of getting a little bit more back into the world of work while I figured out, okay, what am I properly going to do for the next couple of years? But then it just was great fun. I learned loads. I ended up very quickly becoming an employee, and then actually became director and business partner. So I think saying yes to opportunities that maybe aren't what you're looking for now can very much open other doors or develop in unexpected ways.
And the idea of doing it pro bono, doing some kind of volunteering work, it's something that I wrote about in my book. There is, number one, volunteering is proven to help your mental health and well-being. Like, it has massive impact on those things in a great, great way. But also it can help you to, as you say, very safely explore different types of work, different types of environment, working with different types of people. And so often it's actually through things like volunteering or getting involved in community things where we find some of that passion and purpose, and can really find a job through that, through the passions, through the things that you really enjoy doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it brings you opportunities to practice doing things that you might not otherwise have the chance to practice. So if, for example, if you are someone that's taken some time out from work and you're volunteering as a way of getting back into the world of work, it gets you back into the work interactions, the dynamics of being in meetings, of having to navigate disagreements or, brainstorming conversations, just all those work behaviors that might feel a bit rusty at first. So, and plus you get to grow another network, which, as you say, may lead somewhere in the direction you want it to go, or may just be a great kind of side hustle alongside the other thing you want to focus on.
And sometimes it can be that side hustle, or it can be filling a gap that's maybe an area of your work where you don't get to do those things. So if you, even if you have a, a full-time job or a gig or whatever it is that you do for work in the kind of paid sense, sometimes the volunteering fills a purpose need, or it fills a community need, or it fills a, I just want to go and do something useful, or I want to feel connected to something. So I think, the idea, number one, it might lead you to a job, it might not, but it might lead you to such a rich experience of kind of life as a whole, not just in work. And it's really interesting, obviously, the work that you went on to do then, and thinking about kind of parents in the workplace. And obviously you were a new parent at the time you started doing the work, and then working through it. So your kind of lived experience and your work must have kind of come together really nicely then.
They did, in that it was my first biological child, but I have two grown-up stepchildren who are now 26 and 28, and they've been in my life since they were 7 and 9. So weirdly, I did the kind of preteens and teenage years first with them, whilst all my friends were going through, toddler years, and then kind of ended up going back and as a kind of slightly older mother, went through the baby and toddler years. So I did it in a slightly unusual order. But yeah, it was great to access all that advice. But also it made me belatedly realise firsthand what a lot of my colleagues during my consulting years had been talking about kind of offline to me, about how they found that juggle of home and children and careers. And I really got it much more viscerally when I went through it myself.
It's a first-hand experience will often do that for you. Yes. It kind of gives you that, oh, this is what people have been going on about for ages.
Yeah.
And then into your new world, so taking on, kind of becoming your own business, becoming freelance. And tell me a little bit about the inspiration behind your book and where the thinking came from.
Yes, so it's a good question. So the idea to write a book, the desire to write a book, had always been there for a very long time. And I don't know if it was, I think it was you that might have mentioned this in one of your podcasts, that originally I thought I really wanted to write a novel, a children's book. Somebody I heard mention that recently. And then I suddenly had a light bulb moment in that summer of 2020, when I was talking to a number of different people about career transitions and just kind of having lots of useful roaming conversations to help me think through how I was going to pitch my business and what I was going to focus on. And I suddenly realized that actually the thing I had been doing for years was researching and writing about our world of work and people's experiences in organizations and of their work lives. And I thought, well, why don't I write a business book about that? It never really crossed my mind before to write a business book. So I instantly felt much more comfortable with that, because I still had a little imposter syndrome voice in my head from my A-level teacher telling me, you shouldn't really do English A-level or something like that.
It's amazing how long the imposters stay for about things like that.
And those little throwaway comments that lodge in your brain forever.
Yeah.
I know. So, and actually speaking to another author from the Practical Inspiration, fabulous author community, put me on to our publisher, Alison, and actually went from an idea I'd been noodling on that summer about how we think about time at work, partly from my own experiences of work, from working all hours, working flexibly, working part-time, working overtime, just the whole trying to fit life in around work. And also, I guess, my interest and my expertise around organizations, group dynamics, what habits get established in organizations, how you construct them, how you manage them, and looking at that organizational picture. So I realized that if I was to draw two overlapping circles, one for an organization and one for the individual in their career, really the bit I'm most focused on is the bit in the middle where they overlap. So that's why I'm focusing on creating work cultures, which is the organizational bit, where everyone, and including the individual, can flourish. So it's that intersection that I'm most interested in. And then the book, so the book came about really quickly from being connected with Alison, doing her proposal challenge, and then somehow finding myself winning the publishing contract. So it went from idea really to publishing contract in about 6 weeks, which was
and you're like, now I've got to write this thing.
Totally. I remember holding the contract in my hands on the sofa going, okay, so that's what this winter's going to look like.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah.
So it's like from idea to actually authoring very, very quickly.
It was, and completely unexpectedly fast. So that really dictated really what my work was going to be like for the next 18 months, really. So seven months effectively to write it, very collaboratively, interviewing lots of different people, which I really enjoyed. It was a lovely way of keeping connected with people during a time of isolation.
Yeah.
But also a real joy to do a deep dive into something. It was so satisfying to just really explore a topic in depth and write about it and think really hard about it. That felt very luxurious, coming from I guess a previous role, which was all about speed and volume and, quite different.
The operation of getting things done.
Exactly.
A
real deep soak in a topic.
Yeah. And isn't it fun interviewing people?
Yes. I'm incredibly nosy about people's careers and what makes them tick. I think that's the common thread through my career, actually, is just my interest in what makes people tick and how we behave individually and together, and the habits we end up adopting and how well they work for us. So it's a bit like, I love, nosing around houses and, as we do, browsing houses online and things and seeing people's friends' beautiful homes. But I'm a bit the same about people's work lives.
Yeah. I'm totally the same. And it's so funny because I'm giggling at myself, because looking on like Rightmove or whichever thing that you prefer to look on at houses and going around show homes and interviewing people are some of my favorite things to do. And I always said about the podcast is that even if no one listens to it, I would do it because I find it fascinating.
Yes.
So it's not about how many people listen. It's about, actually, I love getting to know what, as you say, what makes people tick. I love hearing about the randomness, or the as it seems, randomness of people's careers, when everyone thinks they should be nice and neat and tidy and they never are. And it's totally fascinating. So I can imagine that part of the process must have been really joyful. And I'm just thinking about this kind of one of the things I always think about time, and I'm sure we can talk a bit more about that kind of the time stuff at work, is that I think us as humans, I think we have a really weird relationship with time. And I think sometimes time goes by in an instant because you're kind of in the flow and it's joyful and it's wonderful. And you're like, oh, it's all gone. And then sometimes, especially at work, some days are like, is this day ever going to end? So there's like that, the individual kind of how we interact with time is really interesting. And I love this idea of like where the organization and where the individual intersect. So dive in a little bit for me. Talk to me a little bit about the intersection, what you discovered, and anything that you think might be useful for our listeners to have a little noodle on. I think you said noodle before. I love that as an expression. Have a little noodle on.
Yeah, sure. So I think when it comes to time and our relationship with time, I agree. It's a weird and wonderful subject, and obviously I've read a lot around it, and it's highly subjective. But there's also a lot of research and neuroscience around it. And if you're interested in knowing why does time seem to fly by versus go really slowly, and why does like a holiday seem really long at the beginning and have disappeared a flash by the time you get to the end, then the great book is Time Warped by Claudia Hammond, the broadcaster, which explains a lot of the neuroscience and the psychology around that. And the other aspect that I was really interested in around time is that most of the books and the advice and the tools out there are really aimed at the individual, helping us to be more efficient with our time, get more done, basically, do it quicker, faster, and be more productive. And I'm all for that. I am right up there, signed up, fully paid up member of whatever time management tools and hacks are available.
I'll take them all.
Yeah, I've certainly tried more than my fair share. And there's two things with that. Firstly, they work, but that's the problem. In my experience, the more you focus on doing things more efficiently, you end up spinning very fast on a hamster wheel. And actually what it doesn't help you do is get off your hamster wheel and get some control over it. And I think that bit gets lost in all the advice. And then secondly, I think the piece that we don't talk about so much and we don't pay attention to is the system that we're all running so fast in at work. So there's this kind of assumption that time management is really just a thing that an individual employee has to be good at. But hang on, they're operating in this whole system with processes and technology and accepted ways of behaving, like norms. And nobody's really acknowledging that bit. And you can only push so fast swim against the tide to a certain degree, but actually we have to look at the tide itself. So instead of just trying to leave it to the individual to manage that massive flood of work and incoming information and short-term deadlines and all that, actually we need to look at the way we're working together, what we're valuing about how we're spending our time, what we're not valuing but really should be, what we're paying attention to, what we're not, and really lining up all the aspects of the organization to help people work productively, make it feel like it's sustainable, and to your brilliant book, to make sure there's opportunities for joy and connection and enriching experiences. It's not just a treadmill of tasks.
Yeah, and I've been scribbling with very, very definite, like, yes, we need to talk about this because they're so interesting. And as you know, I am a big believer in the power of personal responsibility, and it does, individuals do need to do things around time management.
Yes,
but you're so right.
Agreed.
There's only so much an individual can do. There is a point at which the system within which they work, their workplace culture, their leadership, their management, their colleagues, the people who report into them, those things will all have an impact as well. And just the individual could be, the best time management expert ever, and if they are playing in a system that just keeps adding to more and more things, they're gonna at some point fall off the hamster wheel, however good they are running around it.
Yeah. And then that's no good for their business that they're working for
No.
either long term. And that's a big argument I make in my book, is that this isn't just about a nice to have or a nice to do or an employee benefit. It's not there to just benefit the individual. And I think that's often when we think about well-being is kind of the view of it that is really there to look after the employee. Actually, it makes phenomenal business sense to be helping people to manage their time really well, and to be creating an organization and an environment that lets people focus on the priorities, that gives them the right kind of environment to concentrate or to collaborate or to do some deep work, that makes it possible for people to work at their best.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because if we, take it from the example of like the well-being conversation, yes, obviously individuals are responsible for their well-being, but the organization has a role to play too. And so often what happens is I've seen it time and time again. It's like, right, okay, well-being. Okay, well, we'll put a yoga class on and that's our well-being strategy. It's like, okay, great. Brilliant, you've done something. But actually it's not really looking at what's the cause of the problem, what's the potential solution that actually really helps people to be able to take responsibility for their well-being in a supported environment that will enable them to do great work. Because that's the idea, isn't it? If you can enable people to do great work, you have a great business.
Yeah.
But if people struggle from burnout, if people have too much to do within the limited time that they have, there's so many different things that can go wrong. So tell me, because I'm fascinated about this. From an organizational perspective, obviously you spent years doing change management, organizational development, you're in the zone. What are some of the things on a practical level that if an organization wants to look at this subject, which they should, because it's so the amount of people who I speak to who say one of my biggest causes of being gloomy at work, which then leads to disengagement, which leads to poor productivity, etc., is I have too much to do in the time I've got to do it.
Yeah, that's such a common comment that I hear a lot, and that new things get added all the time and nothing really gets taken away or off the plate. Well, I think to answer your question about what can we do to change the way people work or change the environment, I mean, in the book I talk about the 6 traits of time positive organizations, or organizations that manage and value time really well. And they're from things like, being really clear about the outcomes people are looking to achieve, designing the organization really carefully with that in mind, creating community as well, but also about having quite experimental growth mindset, for example, not being afraid to try doing things differently and to see what they learn from it. So there's that kind of more, I guess, strategic organizational piece, which would be quite a big task, I guess, to transform an organizational culture. So I try and break it down a little bit, because not every organization wants to start with, the great big holistic, let's fix it all at once approach.
and that's possibly what puts people off, isn't it, as well? It's like, this seems too big and too scary.
Yeah.
And at the moment we're kind of holding on with our fingernails. So let's just keep holding on rather than attacking this big problem.
Yeah. And also it feels quite intangible. So I think the challenge is to make it feel very real and very relevant for the day-to-day work that gets done. So to really talk about it in terms of the work that we do every day and what we're trying to achieve in our jobs and in our teams. And I talk about the concept of time intelligence, creating time intelligent organizations, but also time intelligent leaderships and teams that have great levels of time intelligence. And that really is about building awareness, paying attention to what we're so busy on, whether it's the right things, how we're doing that work together, like how are we communicating and exchanging information, and what are our working patterns, how are we respecting people's boundaries, what assumptions are we making about people's availability, all of that. But also, so when are we making time for learning and development, for mentoring, for team celebrations and human connections? It's about the human aspect as well as the task aspect. So I guess that's the kind of stuff I get teams to look at, and a good place to start. Well, there are two options really. One would be, if you're a leader listening to this, is to start thinking and exploring, your own habits and choices when it comes to how you spend your time. So building your own TQ or time intelligence, what signals are your habits inadvertently perhaps sending to other people around the way that we need to be working around here, or what's taken as the norm. A second route in, if you're not necessarily in an executive leadership position, but you're part of a team or you're managing a team, is to have a facilitated conversation about this as a team. Because usually we're all so busy getting on with what we think is the priority that we forget to talk about what we're all so busy with.
We're all so busy. We're busy. Oh, should we even be thinking or doing that?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not a great big exercise. It can be, it can be done in an hour or a couple of hours, at least the first good bite at it. And there's some tools to download on my website that can help you with that. We might come on to that later, but it's not rocket science. It does need some time together, but it's also an incredible way of, I guess, reviewing and adapting the working patterns you've fallen into, or maybe some new patterns you've adopted post-pandemic, seeing how well they're working for people, and knowing just what's getting in the way of people being able to work at their best, but also maybe what's working really well for people that you can do more of or replicate elsewhere.
Yeah. And I by the way, I totally love the phrase time intelligence and the kind of TQ aspects of the book. I think it's such an interesting way to look at things. And the way I was thinking about it was that actually, if you can get really good at TQ, the other Qs will get better. So if you're good at TQ, you'll have more time potentially to invest in your LQ, in your learning, which might make you more emotionally intelligent for your EQ, which actually will probably increase your level of IQ. It's not a do this or, it's a do this and, isn't it? It's do this and something else will actually benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very virtuous circle in a way, what you've just described, because, when you're much more mindful and conscious of the way you're spending your time, what you're choosing to invest your time in, what return you're getting from that investment of time, because there's always a choice and there's always a trade-off. And you're getting clearer then on, okay, I could focus on this list of tasks, or I can pick up the phone and have a quick chat with that person that just sounded a bit low in the meeting yesterday. It's almost like a muscle that you're exercising much more regularly, is stopping and thinking, okay, what's the priority now, or what's going to make the biggest difference now, or what's going to help me lead my team better now. Keep coming back during the day, during the week, and looking ahead as well and saying, how do I want to be spending my time?
Yeah. And sometimes it is just that little moment of pause, isn't it? To think, where should I be spending my time, rather than just kind of like the keep on swimming thing. Keep on swimming. Yeah. Versus actually, if I took 5 minutes, it doesn't have to be long, does it? To think, am I investing my time in the right way? And I've kind of written it down as like ROTI, return on time investment.
Yes.
And it's making me think of some lovely, yummy bread when I say that.
Oh, I was thinking chickens, roast chickens, even though I'm vegetarian.
It's so funny how our brains go in such random directions. It's to think about, just taking a moment. And it's so similar to something I wrote in my book around, actually, if you want to get better at boundaries, the first thing you need to do is pause before you say something, before you agree to something. It's almost the same thing, isn't it? Like, what am I doing with my time today? Is it, the best investment, or should I be thinking about doing something differently? Should we swap something? I love the idea of like experimenting with it, and how do we do things differently, and how do we mix up our working patterns? Because I think for so long, for so many hundreds of years, working patterns have been based on kind of this idea that you come to work at, a certain time and you finish at a certain time. But that time frame may not be when you do your best thinking. It might not be, suitable for you in kind of your life beyond work and kind of all the other responsibilities that you have. Like if you're a parent, if you're a carer, if you've got things that you want to do outside of work. So actually, having a conversation with the people you work with about just even about time and how you work best could have some major impact from a simple conversation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you just described it beautifully. That is a huge benefit of opening up this kind of conversation here. And that's really why in my book subtitle, I included the word, diversity, because it's not just about boosting productivity and well-being. And people were saying to me originally, I get the productivity and I get the well-being, but why the diversity? But the more I looked into it and the more I spoke to people, that was absolutely in there. And to your point about, work isn't just a place, i.e. the office now, and it's not just 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or 6 till 6, whatever your work pattern was like. It's much more asynchronous, being done at different times, logging on and off at different times. It's in multi-locations, as we know.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great benefits or silver linings in a way that for the world of work that came out of our enforced mass remote working was this recognition at last that we are all individuals, and what's going to work well for one person isn't going to work well for another person. So I think there's much greater emphasis on personalization from a kind of employer-employee relationship now. So a great way into helping team members to flourish is to explore this conversation and say, okay, when do you work at your best? When is it difficult to work? And we're not always going to be perfectly able to respect people's preferences 100% of the time. There's always a trade-off, and if we want flexibility from our employer, we have to offer flexibility as well, to your point about kind of individual responsibility. But there will be a sweet spot most of the time, but we won't know what it is unless we talk about it.
Yeah. And it's like, as a team, if we wanted to do a really effective team meeting, doing it when somebody's brain switches off probably isn't a great time to do it. But if you all do it, are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Are you a person who has to leave at a certain time? Are you a person who, even just things like, are you a person who thrives on a deadline or panics on a deadline? So for me, a deadline is like the best thing for productivity for me. It is the best thing. If I don't have one, productivity kind of stalls. For other people, if there's a deadline, it adds way too much stress. So just understanding each other as humans and how we work and how we tick will make a difference on how we spend our time.
Yeah, absolutely. We all work in different ways, and we're not all going to, find a short deadline exciting or motivating. As you say, it may just stress us out. But to really get the best out of one another as a team, but also to be great colleagues and, provide good support and work together in a way that's less stressful and hopefully a lot more empathetic and fun, is to find these things out about one another.
And to maybe be the colleague that goes, hey, Helen, didn't you need to pick your kid up in 15 minutes time? Shouldn't you be leaving?
Exactly.
and all those kind of little nudges and which show support that aren't oh, are you leaving again? That's like, no, you need to go do that bit of your life.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I was interviewing actually an HR director recently, and they were reflecting back over their long career, and they were saying that, 10 years ago or so, 5-10 years ago, it would be quite normal for them to be in an office kind of 7 o'clock on a Friday evening, finishing stuff up, whatever. And that would be taken as totally normal. And people wouldn't be saying, why are you still here? Whereas now, this person was saying, now actually I'll have finished my work maybe at 3 or 4 o'clock some Fridays because I've got up extra early to finish it, or I've just called it quits after a really full week. And, I'm heading out for a walk or heading to the golf course. And if somebody says, are you available? I say, no, I'm playing golf. That's amazing that conversation is accepted now, when they said it would just not have been possible to say that or do that 5 or 10 years
ago. It's so interesting. It totally reminds me of an ex-boss of mine, wonderful ex-boss, who's an HR director as well. One of her great pieces of advice to new leaders is to leave loudly.
Yes.
So if you're going to go to your kids' Christmas play, if you're going to get your hair cut, if you're going to do something that is life related, don't sneak out. Because what you should do is say, this is what I'm going to do. And it gives other people kind of that permission to take a back a bit of time when they can as well. Bearing
Yeah.
in mind that most people work really blooming hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think be unapologetic about it. And that's something I talk about in the book and in kind of my coaching is, knowing your boundaries and your needs and being open about your availability, but, without apologizing for it. I think a lot of the time we say, oh, sorry, I can't do this time. Well, it's okay. As long as you're communicating clearly about when you're available, when the work will get done, then that's a really effective conversation.
Yeah. And I think that idea of not apologizing is such an important one for all of us to think about, is that it's okay to set a boundary. It's okay to say you're not available. You don't actually have to be available all the time. You don't. You can't. It's impossible. And so often we apologize for stuff that we actually don't need to apologize for because we feel bad about it. But taking the control and taking the ownership is part of that personal responsibility. You have a responsibility to communicate this stuff as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's going to help everyone that you're working with. People can't support your boundaries if they don't know about them in the first place.
Exactly.
And I think by talking about this stuff together and talking about, your preferences, but around how you work, but also in the context of how are we going to deliver what we're here to do, deliver it on time and to great quality, meet our targets, meet our objectives. You have to look at all those interdependencies because we're not all operating in our own little bubbles. We are highly interconnected, highly interdependent. And the great thing about taking a little bit of time to invest time in having these conversations and looking at what needs adjusting and trialing some adjustments is that when it works, when you manage it and you do it well, actually what you end up doing is giving time back to people, which honestly is so much more valuable to us than another mindfulness session that we can't get to.
Absolutely. And that idea for me, I always think that 99% of people come to work to do a brilliant job. They're not there trying to do a bad job. So if we can help them in any way to do a great job, let's do that, rather than think about, oh no, we have to set these very strict time things because everybody needs to be here between this time and this time. Some jobs, yes, of course they do. If you're on a shift rota and there's a customer of, there are reasons why some people have to do that, but there are also reasons why they don't need to. So it's about understanding all that individual stuff. And you're right, there is no such thing as perfect. Not everyone's complete preferences will be able to be exactly right because we're working with other humans. But even if you could get like 70% of the way there for most people, that's amazing.
Yeah. It is, absolutely. And I think people will feel so much more motivated, engaged, committed. I think the organization will reap the benefits in many, many different ways, from improved levels of productivity to staff and employee engagement to retention and to making better progress towards your diversity and inclusion goals. Because often people who are in the minority in some way in the organization, whilst they might get into the organization, often it's the experience there of feeling like they're not quite fitting, or their voice isn't being valued, or it takes them longer to progress in their careers versus majority colleagues. These are all the things I dug into in the book from a diversity and inclusion angle. Actually, they'll end up leaving or making slower progress or not being able to give their full contribution and meet their full potential. So as an employer, you are missing out on that wonderful talent, breadth of talent that you're saying you want to make the most of, but you're inadvertently not helping people to flourish.
Definitely. It's such an interesting one. I'm sure we could actually spend another couple of hours going through all of these wonderful things. And I'm like, oh, it's so exciting. But we do need to keep to our time frame. So if it's okay with you, Helen, I'm going to move us on to our quick fire questions. Are you ready?
I am.
Right. Question number 1's a personal one. And this one is, what is always guaranteed to bring you personally a little bit of work joy?
Great question. So I think when I look back over my career and when I've really loved work, I think there are 3 ingredients, if I'm allowed to have 3 rather than 1. Okay. 1 is I'm growing in some way, my skills, my knowledge, my network. I just love learning about stuff and discovering new things I can do and how the pieces fit together. Secondly is actually just talking and collaborating with great people, whether that's a fantastic mentor, just fun colleagues, or people just doing interesting stuff in a similar space. And thirdly, for me, and this is something that I've come to recognize more slowly over my career, is freedom to operate.
Yeah.
And that's not just me speaking as somebody who now works independently, but I experienced it and really valued it in my consulting role. I was very fortunate in that consultancy. It was a very trust-based organization, very forward-thinking. We all worked flexibly, and there wasn't even a flexible working policy at the time. You were just trusted to get on and deliver. And I only realize now really quite how rare that was 10, 15 years, 20 years ago. And I'm like, what, you mean everyone else hasn't had that experience?
You were ahead of your time in the future of time.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think I realized for me that's important. I need to be able to influence what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, and craft my role. And I think if I were still working in an organization, I would still apply that principle of, okay, how can I shape my role? How can I negotiate focusing on the stuff I really want to focus on, or to grow in the way I want to grow, etc.
Great, love that. And with me, you're always allowed to break the rules, so I love having three things. It's great. Right, second question. What book are you currently reading?
So I'm currently reading a novel, a very short novel. So if you're not someone that loves big, heavy books, or you haven't got much time, this is a good one for you. And it's called The Cat Who Stole Books. And it's a translation, and it's written by a Japanese author called Sosuke Natsukawa. And honestly, this book just popped off the library shelf at me. I hadn't heard of it. I get through a lot of books. I read about a book a week, usually alternating fiction and non-fiction. So this is my fiction read, and the title just totally got me, and the fact that it had amazing reviews. So I love that. And I've just finished for my business book, in case listeners would enjoy a good business book recommendation, Choosing Courage, which is about how to consciously and competently be courageous at work.
Ooh,
and that's
I love that.
by Jim Detert. Yeah.
Okay. I like the idea of both of those. And one of my goals for this year is to actually get back into reading some fiction. I'm a kind of business book, as you probably are. I read a lot in that world. But I forget how much I love a fiction book. And then when I read it, I'm like, oh, it's so wonderful to get lost in that. Totally. And not to be making notes and highlighting and kind of having post-it notes all over it, and having to read with an entire stationery set just to read for the joy of it.
Yes, absolutely. Without the purpose of learning and applying. It's just very indulgent, isn't it?
It feels a little bit selfish, but in a really, really good way.
Yeah.
Right. Question 3. What's the best or most useful bit of advice that someone has given you in your lifetime that you find yourself always coming back to?
Yes. So some amazing advice given to me by a very dear friend and mentor, someone who managed me for quite a long time, was my people manager in consulting, was to always have a plan B and make it really enticing. And she gave me this advice when we were struggling to conceive our daughter. We had to go through IVF, and we were actually told we wouldn't be able to have our own child. And it was a really difficult time in my life. And she sat me down and helped me work up a plan B for my life and my work that might not involve the child I really wanted to have. And it was just such heartfelt and fantastic advice. And it's always stuck with me. And I recently read another book called Quit, The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away by Annie G.
Yeah.
Brilliant book. And she talks about the same kind of thing. You need to always be exploring other options all the time.
Yeah.
You may not pursue them, but I think the key to that advice I was given by my friend was making it really enticing, really make it a strong, viable option that you can see yourself enjoying or giving a go.
So it's not plan B as in like, oh, we'll do it if we have to. It's plan B as in like, actually, this is another option we could look at, which might be just as good as plan A.
Exactly. Yeah. That you could get really excited about.
That's really, really good advice. I love that. I'm going to think about that as well. And actually having that plan, and even when it feels hard to have it, actually sitting down and writing it and knowing what it is that it could be and what your life and work might be like. It's often I say to people who are, even if they're really happy in their jobs, like just go and have a little search on the internet and what's out there. What are other people doing in their jobs? What comes as part of that job title now? Because not for leaving purposes, but for actually, if other people in the kind of job I'm doing are doing this, could I add that to my portfolio? How could I expand and kind of do
Yeah.
this? So actually, that might be an option B, but it might also be something that helps you with your option A. It could be both
Yes.
ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. It could be to grow from what you're already doing, where you're already
Mm,
doing it, and open up new opportunities there.
yeah. Or you might go, oh, actually, that plan B bit could fit in. There's so many ways of thinking. I love that bit of advice. What a great friend and mentor that person was. Well
Yes.
done them.
Yeah. Yes.
What's
Absolutely.
one? Well done them. They can be credited. What's your one super practical bit of advice to our listeners? That's something that you think they could go and do now, do tomorrow, do the next day, but might help them get a bit more work joy, and why?
Yes, great question. And it's going to be time related because I
Funny that.
think, yeah, because, we all have very precious amounts of time, usually overfull. So I wanted to offer something that might help anybody listening who feels like they never have enough time. And that is to take 5 minutes today, whenever you're listening to this, or as soon as you can safely afterwards, to think about something you are frequently or regularly spending your time on that may have become a habit or something you do comfortably because you've got familiar with it, and ask yourself, why am I doing it? Just have a check-in. Is this thing still serving me well? What return am I
Yeah.
getting on it? Actually, do I still need to be doing it? Or could I be doing it differently in a way that will be more rewarding for me? So,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of the time we fall into these habits that have kind of evolved, or maybe we're not paying that much attention to. So it's really good to stop and ask ourselves the question and see what we notice. And then we can
Yeah.
choose what we do about it.
Yeah. And you might say, do you know what? That's fine. That one thing I thought about in my head today, I don't need to change anything about that. But you might also go, hang on a minute, if I just did this slightly differently, what if I did that at the beginning of my day rather than the end of my day? What difference might that make?
Yeah,
There's so many different experiments you can do with time. It's kind of unlimited, isn't it, in what
it
you
is.
could explore?
Yes, exactly. And that's a great way to think of it. Think of, if you do notice something, the next question might be, so what's a micro experiment I could try here?
Yeah, definitely. Love that. And then finally, where can people find out more about you and your work, get in touch with you, all of that kind of stuff?
Thank you. I'd love it if people did get in touch. So my website is a good place to start, helenbeedham.com. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well. I think I'm Helen J. Beedham there, and on Instagram and Twitter, and I have a YouTube channel, and other ways to, I guess, keep in touch, continue the conversation, or if you're interested in some of the stuff I've been talking about, to see what's new thinking and writing. I have a newsletter that goes out once a month, so you can subscribe on the mailing list, and that usually has a heads up on interesting things that I'm doing that are coming up, and offers for mailing list subscribers as well around my
Great.
coaching or around team workshops, etc.
Excellent. And what we'll do is we'll put those links into the show notes so that people can click straight on them and get straight through to being in contact, or downloading any of your resources or getting signed up for the newsletter. So
Yes.
thank you
Fabulous.
so much, Helen. I'm taking loads of great stuff away from the conversation. And I think it's such an interesting thing for us all to maybe kind of think and stop and reflect on, what are we doing to develop our TQ and how we could use that as a real tool for having more joy at work. I love it. And it's a great thing, a great subject for us all to noodle on a little bit more and to take away with us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking with you, Beth.
A huge thank you to Helen for joining me on this episode of the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I always like to do a little summary of the things that I'm really taking away from our conversations, and there are so many today. I think this idea of developing your TQ, your kind of time intelligence, is one that I know I could personally benefit from, but one I also see that many people could benefit from, because it's almost the key to the other type of intelligences, right? If we have a better use of our time, better productivity within that time, we could be better at our emotional intelligence, we could be better at our learning intelligence, so many different things to think about there. So that has really landed with me and stuck in my mind, as has the idea that we don't have to make it big and complicated to start with. Actually, it could be an hour's conversation amongst the team. It could be the question of, how do you work best? Where does your energy flow? Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Are you a middle of the day person? And even just starting to understand how we as individuals collectively then relate to time, I think could be a great way of starting to make that organizational impact, of starting to feel like we're all part of this time intelligence thing, and we can actually work together to make some things happen. And also some wonderful advice that Helen had there around the plan B option, making it exciting, making it enticing, making it almost as good as plan A, but in a different way. And I think for me, that's something I'm really going to step away with as well. So I do hope you enjoyed this conversation. You can find the links that Helen talked about in the show notes. And if you're interested in finding out more about WorkJoy, the book WorkJoy, A Toolkit for a Better Working Life is available now in all good bookstores. The Club WorkJoy, which is a wonderful community of people working together to develop their own WorkJoy. We come together with speakers, we come for coaching and collaboration, and we have an app as well. So do have a look at createworkjoy.com if you're interested in the community. And remember, there's lots and lots of episodes of the WorkJoy Jam available for you now. We're on season 6, so plenty of opportunity for you to go and listen to different perspectives, different people, and different advice for how you can perhaps get a little bit more joy in your working life. Thank you.